Alright, so here we go. So this is special cases and good examples of dual innervation in the autonomic nervous system. So by request, I was also wanting to make this video too, because it's very important and we got a lot of good examples of it in class. So I kind of put up like an order of events just to kind of keep it in my own mind. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the eye and the autonomic innervation in the eye, because it is a very good example of the dual innervation of organs, effector organs of the autonomic nervous system. So a lot of the people were asking, the eye's kind of confusing. It is kind of confusing, but there's one thing to remember with the eye. The way I like to start, as you know, is small to big. We never got to lose sight of that big picture. Like we can't, we always got to think of what kind of effect we want in the organ. So with the parasympathetic system in the eye, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do the opposite of the sympathetic division in this case. The sympathetic division is going to allow you to fight or flight. So it's going to, what do you want to do with the eye when you fight or flight? You want to see as much as possible. See what's going to attack you. See the punch coming or something like that. So we never lose sight of that, and it can become easier to remember all these. So I'm just going to go ahead and label off the receptors in the eye. So we've got the muscarinic 3, the alpha 1, the beta 1, and the beta 2, which doesn't really do much. Okay? So these first two, or this first one here, is, as we know, part of our parasympathetic tract. Okay? So, and these three here are going to be a part of our sympathetic tract. So the first thing I like to talk about with the eye is the pupil, because it's a really good place that you can figure out what's going on. Okay? So our pupil, let's draw like that. I'm not an artist and do not claim to be. Is controlled by a couple different muscles. And the way that it is controlled allows us to either open it up to let more light in, or close it down to let more, or don't let as much light in. And there's a couple of different ways to remember that. Well, we've got two pairs of antagonistic muscles that work against each other to pull it either open or pull it closed. So that first set of muscles is called the radial muscles. And the second set of muscles, which I'll show you is appropriately named, is called the sphincter muscles. Okay? So the radial muscles, they're going to be innervated by, or going to be responsible for opening up the eye. They're going to increase the radius of the eye, or the pupil, excuse me. The radius of the pupil. So what's the radius? Remembering back to like high school geometry or something? It's like the half a diameter of a circle. So we're going to increase that radius using the radial muscles. So if I'm increasing the radius and making it bigger, that is to make the pupil bigger, what's going to be active? It's going to be the sympathetic tract of the nervous system. So the sympathetic tract, in the case of these radial muscles, is innervated by our alpha 1 receptor. Okay? And that makes sense, right? Because alpha 1 receptors induce smooth muscle contraction, right? We learned that earlier. And this is also the one that I'm going to touch on later that antagonizes the action of M3, which has got to go pee. Okay? We got our sphincter muscles, which are going to be the exact opposite. So they're going to be innervated by our M3, which is our only parasympathetic receptor in the eye. Easy one to remember. Only one in the eye. That is for the parasympathetic tract. The sphincter muscles are accurately named because they are going to constrict the pupil. And what do sphincters do in the body? What does the anal sphincter do? It closes up tight so you don't crap your pants. Pretty accurate name for a sphincter, or for a muscle that closes something down, right? closes down on an opening. So maybe that kind of gets a little bit easier to remember. The also way I remember that the sphincter muscles are going to close down on the pupil is that with a lot of people with heroin, and heroin really activates your parasympathetic nervous system, and the way to remember that is just because people who do heroin, if you see them, they're kind of like in a trance and like, you know, they're like euphoric because they are tripping out on heroin and because it's making them feel really, really good. Well, you don't feel really, really good when your sympathetic nervous system is active, I can tell you that right now. So that is the reason that your pinpoints are going to get, or your pupils are going to be pinpoint when you're doing the drug. Okay. So our second place that we find our autonomic nervous receptors in the eye is the case of the lens, which is another good place to find dual innervation of an organ. Okay? So this is our lens right here. There's going to be two things we can do with the lens. I'm sorry that you guys have to watch my shitty drawing. So what are we going to do with the lens, okay? Well, we're going to, in essence, be able to see either close up or far away based on what we do with these, what are called ciliary muscles. Okay? Ciliary muscles. They have receptors on them just like the radial and sphincter do in the eye for both of the tracts. They are actually one set of muscle, but they're going to have two different receptor types on them that are going to do opposite things. Okay? So the N3, which is the parasympathetic tract, the only one in the eye, is going to activate these receptors. N3, gotta go pee, so it's going to like squeeze down on your bladder. Well, it's going to squeeze down on these muscles and make them contract and pull that lens into a longer shape. Okay? Now the other one is our beta 2 receptors. So a lot of you were kind of texting today or messaging me today and pointing out accurately that the beta 2 doesn't kind of follow that inhibitory versus excitatory rule that I had kind of mapped out for you guys. And you're right. So why is it considered excitatory when it actually lets smooth muscle relax? I don't have a good explanation for that, honestly. It's just the way I was taught it, and it's just kind of a general rule to get you thinking about it. And you just got to remember one exception to the rule. It's just like the English language, the autonomic nervous system is. There's always going to be an exception to the rule, right? So, but it makes sense that this receptor is here because this receptor is responsible for smooth muscle contraction, or I mean not contraction, but relaxation, just like in a lot of different things, like in your alimentary canal and stuff like that. So when these relax, the lens is going to take on a more fat, plump shape, kind of like more like a grape, right? All right, so the other thing that we got to talk about is we talked about the alpha 1, the beta 2, and the M3 receptor, but we didn't talk about this beta 1 receptor. Where does that fit in? So that's the only other receptor in the eye, and it is on kind of where these ciliary muscles attach to the wall of the eye. And in these little attachment points, what we call we got what we call ciliary epithelium. So ciliary epithelium holds this really special kind of ability to create this aqueous humor, they call it. So this kind of like, it's just basically sludge that is pumped out to the front of the eye, and actually goes in front of the lens and the pupil out there, okay? So you got your pupil in front. It's going to sit out there at the front of the eye, and this is what's responsible for your increase in eye pressure within the eye. Because the more these are activated by beta-2 adrenergic receptors, the more aqueous humor is going to be produced and pumped out into this space in front of the lens and pupil. And the higher, the more liquid you have in a confined space, the higher the pressure is, right? So that increases the pressure, and that makes sense because it's a sympathetic response. That's why, you know, in this case, the beta-2 receptor absolutely, and the beta-1 receptor, excuse me, because the beta-1 receptor activates this. The beta-1 receptor is perfect for that role because it is an actual sympathetic nervous response. We're increasing pressure, right? I'm sorry, I believe I said beta-2 there, and I apologize, I was wrong. I'm not perfect. So, yeah. It's going to induce a response just like that, all right? All right, so what else do we got here? All right. We are going to talk about the bladder next. Sorry, I'm sending a text here. All right, so I forgot to say one thing here. So when we want to view something near, the ciliary muscles are going to contract. So this is nearsightedness. This is farsightedness. And that deals with the way lenses work, which is a whole other animal in physics, if you want to learn about refracting light. But basically, what you got to remember, making the lens more flat allows you to focus the light better for near sight, for things close up, and making the lens more plump or thicker is going to be better for far sight. All right, so yeah, let me get my spray here. Alright, so we got the bladder next. Let me draw a bladder. Not good at drawing a bladder. So our bladder, we got the eye done now. Our bladder is another good example of the many dual innervations of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to have two. And the first one I want to touch on is not the one that everybody likes repeating to me now. M3 gotta go pee. It's actually the sympathetic tract. So it's the alpha-1 receptor. Alright, so on the outer sphincter of the bladder we have, or I mean on the outer opening, not the opening, the part of the bladder that leads to the urethra, we have this sphincter muscle that's going to allow us to contract and hold our pee. So that is kind of a sympathetic response. And why? Because we don't want to piss ourselves if we're running away from something. Some of us might if it's sufficiently scary, but most of us do not want to piss ourselves as we run away from whatever is scaring us. So that's a good way to remember that. You don't want to piss yourself, so you use your sympathetic nervous system while you're running away. okay? The other one is the M3. It makes you gotta go pee. That's going to act on a muscle called the detrusor muscle, which basically kind of surrounds the bladder. So when M3s are activated, what do? They induce smooth muscle contraction. Smooth muscle contraction is going to decrease the size of the bladder and force urine out of it. Okay? Now that can be opposed if there's no bathroom in sight. That can be opposed by our alpha-1 receptors being activated and inducing smooth muscle contraction in our outer sphincter of the bladder. Okay. So that's that one. That's pretty straightforward and easy. It's much easier than the eye, which is why I like it. And it's got my favorite saying in it, M3's gotta go pee. Alright, some special things I wanted to talk about in the heart. Alright, so in the heart we have two big receptors, okay? We've got our beta-1 receptors, and then we got our M2 receptors. So remember that M2s are going to be the only one from the parasympathetic tract in the heart. Let's draw a terrible heart here, because of how much I love PA school. And let's draw our conduction system in our heart, which is obviously horrible. Don't kill me for being a terrible artist. So our beta-1 receptors, what are they going to do? They mediate the flight or fight response, right? So they're going to increase heart rate, right? So they're going to do that by a couple different mechanisms. They act on very specific parts of the heart, both of these do. So our beta-1 receptors are going to increase heart rate, increase contractility, and increase conductiveness. So the way it does that is it acts on our electrical system of our heart to basically tell it to increase our heart rate, because the electrical system controls our tempo in our heart. It's also going to increase contractility because it's going to allow the heart to fill up more in between contraction. And then it's going to increase conductivity. And this one is kind of important, because we're going to get a question, if we get a question on this, about the difference between the innervation of the sympathetic tract and the parasympathetic tract of the autonomic nervous system in the heart, and the way that plays out with the heart's electrical system. And this becomes important in cardiology. So the beta-1 receptors, they act on the Purkinje fibers in the bundle of His system. And they're going to allow those cells to conduct electricity better, so that they can force the cardiac muscle around them to contract. And when the M2 receptors are active, they are going to be in contrast to this, because they are not going to act on the Purkinje fibers in the bundle branch system. So the beta blockers, the beta receptors, when they're stimulated, they work on the SA node, which is up here, the AV node, or atrioventricular node, which we've probably all heard of, and the bundle of His, the bundle branch system, which is the two branches of the cardiac electric system coming off of the bundle of His, and the Purkinje fibers, which surround the ventricles on the two outer sides and allow all of the ventricles to be innervated. So it's going to increase contractility because it's going to stimulate all of the ventricles